Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to talk about a whole bunch of series I am definitely not going to finish. About 2 years ago, the first summer that I had my channel, I did a series of videos about series. I talked about series that I had finished, series I was going to finish in the future, and series that I was never going to finish, and I thought since it had been 2 years, it was time to update all of these lists. So I'm just gonna give you kind of a highlights list of books from my series I'm gonna finish video that I'm no longer gonna finish, and then we're gonna talk about a whole bunch of series that I've started and then stopped since I made that video 2 years ago. So yeah, I think that's everything, and let's jump in. The first books that I'm going to cover are some series that I talked about in my last video that I have since abandoned. So first up, let's talk about The Immortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare. For some reason, 2 years ago, I was under the illusion that I was going to finish the series, and I'm just not. I read these in high school and kept my copies around for a really long time, but then I kept being told in order to read the 6th one, I had to read the Infernal Devices. I tried to read the Infernal Devices, and I didn't really love it, and it just kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. And finally, back in January, I went, you know what? It's not gonna happen, and I unhauled all of my copies of The Mortal Instruments. I'd had those books since high school, and I am now a college graduate. It just wasn't going to happen, and it was time to acknowledge that this is a series I'm never going to finish. Along those lines, I also want to mention The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. Like I said, I kept being told that this was better than The Mortal Instruments, and that I had to read them before I read the final Mortal Instruments book, and I tried and I read the first one, and I really didn't like it. I didn't think it was better than the other books. I just thought it was okay, and I felt no motivation to ever continue on reading the rest of the series. So, with deciding I wasn't going to read the Mortal Instruments, there was truly no motivation for me to read the Infernal Devices either, and I decided I was going to abandon this series as well. We've also got the Maze Runner series by James Dashner. This is a series that I loved back when it was just a trilogy, when it was just 3 books, and I went to the release party for the 3rd book. I read it. I was a little bit disappointed in the end, but I kind of accepted it, and I thought that would be it. Then a 4th one came out, and I read it, and I thought it was unnecessary. Then a 5th one came out, and I just decided it wasn't going to happen. I didn't like the finale of the 3rd book as it is, and then for there to just keep being more books in a series that I felt had really run its course, I don't know if I would like The Maze Runner and The Scorch Trials if I read them again today. When I read them in high school, I really liked them, but it's a series that I have absolutely no interest in ever picking up again. Next up, the Matteo Alacran series, starting with The House of the Scorpion. This is a series by Nancy Farmer, and this is a case of I loved the first book, and I truly feel it does not need a sequel, and so there's no reason for me to read a sequel. This is a really fabulous book talking about personhood and identity. I think this is a perfectly acceptable standalone book that I really, really loved, and I don't want to continue on to the rest of the books or book. I don't actually know if it's 2 or 3 that have been published since. However, I do highly recommend that you read The House of the Scorpion if you haven't already. It's just a winner. I've also decided to abandon the Unwind Dystology by Neal Shusterman. It was a series I really liked, so I don't know where the passion kind of ran dry on that, because I do really like Neal Shusterman, but it's been years and years, and I have never wanted to go back and reread the first 2 books, and I've never really wanted to go back and reread the next 2. Plus, I'm gonna be honest with myself and say, I'm just not gonna read a dystopian series. It's not gonna happen. If there was a dystopian series on my list that I was planning on finishing, it's a pretty safe bet that I decided not to finish it. I am also not going to be finishing The Wolves of Mercy Falls by Maggie Stiefvater. I have read the first 3 books in this series. They're back here also. This is such a guilty pleasure series about werewolves that I read back when, like, Twilight was big and paranormal fantasy was really, really in. But since reading this trilogy, a 4th book came out named Sinner. It's a companion novel about one of the side characters in the original trilogy, and I'm not gonna read it. Like, these were a guilty pleasure enough on their own with characters that I kind of liked. I don't really want to read a companion novel about a character I don't care about. Plus, now that I've read other books by Maggie Stiefvater and I know how much stronger her writing can be, I just don't feel like I need to go back to this series and finish off the 4th book. And finally, I want to talk about Throne of Glass by Sara J. Maas. I'm sure most of you know that I've abandoned the series already. I unhauled all of my copies back in May. I got really into the series when I first started book 2, read everything that was out, which was up to that point Heir of Fire, and then I read Queen of Shadows, and then I let over a year go by staring at my copy of Empire of Storms, and I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to revisit a thing that made me as angry as Queen of Shadows did and as disappointed as Queen of Shadows did. I didn't really like where the development of any of the characters were going, and I felt like it wasn't the series that I had loved when I first started reading it, so I just decided for my own mental well-being that it wasn't worth it to finish it. Next up, we are going to quickly go through a list of books that should never have gotten companion novels because they really don't need companion novels, and I'm not going to read the companion novel. I'm not going to be reading After You, the companion novel to Me Before You by Jojo Moyes, because, you know, I felt like I really got enough ableism the first time around. I didn't need a second go at this. I'm not going to be reading the next two companion books to the Life as We Knew It series by Beth Pfeffer, because this was a perfectly little contained book on its own. It was terrifying and excellent and suspenseful, and there was no reason for there to be more books. I'm not going to be reading the sequel to Openly Straight by Bill Konigsberg because Openly Straight I don't really like. I feel like a lot of people really loved this book for its like conversation on labels and how labels can be like damaging or overly defining, but I had a lot of problems with the amount of lying that happened in this book, especially between partners, and I super wasn't into it, and I am not at all invested in reading the next one in the series. I'm not going to be reading Just One Year, the sequel to Just One Day by Gayle Forman, because I don't really care about reading what happened to a different character. When it comes to these books that get companion novels, and the companion novel is just the same book from a different character's perspective, why? I don't care. I was invested in that main character and what they were going through. I don't care what the other character was going through. If you're gonna write, like, a sequel and it's about that character but something else, fine. But if it's just gonna cover the time period with a different kid, no. I'm not going to be reading the companion novel to Empress of the World by Sara Ryan. This is the second book in the Battle Hall Davies series. I don't actually remember what it's called. I thought that the first one was really excellent, and considering how early a piece of like queer YA fiction it was, it did a great job about being vocal about bisexuality, but reading the reviews to the second book and it being about a different character than the first one, I'm just not really that invested, and I'll just keep rereading Empress of the World because that was great and I don't need another book. I'm not going to be reading the companion novel to A Tyranny of Petticoats by Jessica Spotswood, or edited by Jessica Spotswood. This is an anthology of historical fiction stories about women through time. It has a great concept, but in my opinion, kind of a poor execution. A lot of the stories are way too big to fit in 20 pages, or they don't flow together all that well, and there are way too many high points and low points, so I'm not really invested in reading another anthology. I am not going to be reading the sequel to Every Day by David Levithan. There is a second book, Another Day, and it is about a character named Rhiannon. If there was one thing I hated the most about Every Day, it was the love interest Rhiannon. I thought that she was awful, and I don't want to read a book about her. There's going to be a third book because there was like this huge plot thing that happened at the end that never got an explanation, so a third book is going to kind of explain that. I might read that book, but you couldn't pay me to read about Rhiannon, frankly. And I'm definitely not reading Hidden Bodies, the sequel to You by Caroline Kepnes, because You was a mess, and I hated it. It definitely didn't need a companion novel. Like, even if I had loved You, it should have stayed its own thing. It did not need a sequel, and from what I've heard review-wise of the sequel, people who loved You agree with me. I'm not really that interested in reading books from the point of view of men who brutalize or stalk women in any way. I just feel like we get enough of that in the real world that I don't need to be reading about men who do this in books, so I hated this. Like, you're supposed to. He's an unlikable character, but every single individual character in the book is pretentious and awful, and the book is so gimmicky. I just didn't like it at all, and it didn't need a sequel, and I won't be reading it. I have also started and stopped 2 comic series that have all female lead characters and all male creative teams, and you can tell. First of all, Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan, Cliff Chang, and Matthew Wilson. This is like set in the 80s, and it's got a really cool vibe. It's really nice to look at, but you can tell that these are a group of 12-year-old girls who were written by a group of grown men, and it just was not nearly enough to keep me invested, because if you're going to have all girls in your comic, hire a woman. Oh my god. Also, Rat Queens by Curtis J. Weeb and Rock Upchurch. This is going for the same reasons, like all-male creative teams with all-female lead characters, but also there's a thing with the illustrator that he was accused of, like, spousal abuse, and he was kicked off the comic and they hired a woman and then they fired the woman. There's a whole thing, you can look it up. I was already not going to read them, but the way that they've handled that situation has also made me incredibly uncomfortable, so I'm not reading the rest of this. And finally, what I'm going to be talking about in this last list are books where I read the first book in the series and it made me yawn, or I didn't care, and I just set it aside and never even bothered pretending I was going to read the next one. First of all, Anna and the French Kiss by Stephanie Perkins. Everyone, loved this when I got on BookTube, and so I tried to give it a read, but I thought it was a pretty average contemporary, didn't like the main character, didn't like the love interest. Seriously, the only thing this book had going for it was the setting, and definitely not enough for me to try to read the next two in the series. I don't want to read any future books in the How to Hang a Witch series by Adriana Mather. I read this a couple of months ago, and it was supposed to be a fun, witchy Salem book, and it really, really was shirking on the witch thing. It was like a YA contemporary, but there was a tiny bit of magic involved, and it was so tropey, and it made me so uninterested in trying to get through any more tropey contemporary masquerading as witch books in the future. I'm also not that interested in reading the next book in the Brooklyn Brujas series by Zoraida Cordova. The first book was Labyrinth Lost. I liked this one a lot more than I liked How to Hang a Witch. I thought it had more going for it, and it was really interesting, but I just wasn't invested enough in any of the characters to continue reading. If you are looking for a good witch book, this is a pretty good witch book, and it's got a bisexual main character. The entire cast is a collection of Latinx main characters, so I do recommend it if that's what you're into, but I didn't really get that much out of it, and so I'm not planning on reading a sequel. Also, definitely not continuing in the Cormoran Strike series by Robert Galbraith, aka J.K. Rowling. I read The Cuckoo's Calling. It was not good at all. Cormoran Strike was terrible, and it was written in this way where men can do the simplest of things and women just fall at their feet, and I hate that trope. It's so, I hate that. The kind of thing where a man shows basic human decency, or a man observes one thing that makes him seem moderately above average intelligence, and women just fling their clothes off in his presence. There was no flinging off of clothes, but that was the vibe I was getting, and I didn't need to read more of that. Also, the mystery wasn't very good. I'm not going to be continuing on in the Half Bad series by Sally Green. I read the first book, liked it. There was a witchy thing going on, guy main character, future potential male-male romance, and then I read the description of the ending. If you are also not a fan of the bury your gaze trope, I would avoid it, and I would also look up spoilers for how this series ends, because it is not good from any standpoint. I'm not going to be reading the second book in the duology of The Torchkeeper by Stephen Dos Santos. The first book was The Culling, I believe, and this was such a dystopian. There was just nothing original about it. It was trope after trope after trope. I appreciated that this was a world where queerness wasn't an issue. The main character was in a male-male romance, and that wasn't a huge deal, but that was the only thing going for this series, which just did not impress me in the first book. Also won't be continuing on in the Deanna Madden series by A.R. Torrey. The first book is The Girl in 6E. I just thought that this book was terribly written. The best thing it had going for it was readability. I read it all in one go on a train ride, and that's nice, I guess, but I thought the main character was written in such an unrealistic way, and the romance was embarrassingly bad. It just, at no point did it hit a note where I was like, oh man, this is pretty good. It really didn't do anything for me, and I have no interest in reading the next two books in the series. I also want to mention Falling Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. I read the first book in this series, and there was nothing original about this. It's a YA high fantasy series. It takes a lot from Game of Thrones, in my opinion. A lot of people have called it the YA Game of Thrones, and, well, it's not a direct ripoff. I just feel if you have read a lot of high fantasy, this book offers nothing new, especially not new characters or characters that you're invested in. So, I read this first book, almost DNF'd it, did manage to finish it, but I'm not going to put myself through more books in the series. And finally, I'm going to talk about Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. It is now called the Shadow and Bone trilogy, as far as I know. It's not the Grisha trilogy anymore. I really want to read Six of Crows, and I think I'm going to love it. Shadow and Bone was just super unoriginal, in my opinion. It's another YA high fantasy series that I read fairly close to Falling Kingdoms, and I was really starting to get annoyed with how tropey they both were. I thought it had some interesting potential in world building, which is why I'm interested in reading Six of Crows, but I didn't really like the main character or care about where the story was going, and so when I finished it, I just immediately decided that the series, at least that trilogy, wasn't going to be for me. Okay guys, there you go. So those are some of the series that I am not going to be finishing at any point. I've abandoned them. It's just not going to happen. There are plenty more that I've abandoned in the last 2 years. I think that I've gotten fairly vicious about which series I'm willing to continue forward in. What do you think about any of my choices? Have you also abandoned these series? Did I mention your favorite series? Let me know your feelings about the stuff I'm abandoning down in the comments below, and look forward to future videos talking about the series that I really want to finish and the series that I have finished. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!